Thank you. Our last guest speaker is Professor Victor Lieberman. Professor Lieberman, you've got 30 minutes. Sorry, not 3 minutes.
I'd like to thank the CSG for the invitation to address you. I'm not going to discuss Resolution 3050. Rather, I've been asked to provide an historic overview of the conflict, in particular the origins and continuation of Israel's presence in the West Bank, that may help to place the resolution in context. The Arab-Israeli conflict grew from the intersection of three historic forces: anti-Semitism, Zionism, and Arab-Palestinian nationalism. Zionism arose in the late 19th century in response to ever more violent and widespread European anti-Semitism. This convinced many Jews that they had no future in Europe and could survive only in a Jewish country of their own. Patterning itself after German and Italian nationalism, Zionism was a nationalist movement that sought a home for the Jews in Palestine, to which Jews had ancient ties. The decisive boost to Zionist fortunes came when the British took over Palestine from the Ottomans in 1918. Britain committed itself to build a so-called national home for the Jewish people. During the 30 years of British rule, 1918 to 1948, the Jewish population of Palestine swelled from 80,000 to 650,000. By 1948, Jews were about half the Arab population of Palestine. During these 30 years, the Jews purchased extensive lands and developed an administrative apparatus that in 1948 became the State of Israel. Now, how did Palestinian Arabs respond to the Zionist influx? It's true that Arab landowners willingly sold to Jews, usually at very high prices. Under the British, no lands were taken by force. But politically conscious Palestinians, without exception, opposed what they saw, understandably, as an alien invasion of their country by unwelcome interlopers. To rally resistance, Palestinian leaders tried to build nationalist organizations on the European model. In other words, much as the threat of anti-Semitism had engendered Zionism, the threat of Zionism now engendered Palestinian nationalism. This is how the three forces, anti-Semitism, Zionism, and Palestinian nationalism, began to intersect. The new Palestinian organizations protested Zionism every way they could think of: petitions, boycotts, strikes. Finally, when peaceful means failed, the Arabs took up arms from 1936 to 1939. This revolt did force the British to withdraw official support for Zionism. Yet Britain's reversal came too late, and Palestinian actions proved too feeble to halt the Zionist momentum. Why? Palestinian society was less cohesive, less literate, hence less easily mobilized than the Jews. The idea of a specifically Palestinian political community was entirely novel and thus had shallow roots. Most importantly, as anti-Semitism, not only in Nazi Germany, but Poland, Hungary, Romania, and the Baltic states, grew ever more genocidal, European Jews became ever more desperate to find refuge. No other place would admit them. In the 1930s, they therefore flooded Palestine. These events came to a head after World War II. The Holocaust increased Jewish determination to escape the non-Jewish world's hostility by building an independent state. But at the same time, ironically, the Holocaust increased sympathy for Jewish aspirations in Europe, North America, and Latin America. The result was the vote by the United Nations General Assembly in November 1947 to create two states in Palestine, one Jewish, the other Arab. Jews exulted. They had a state for the first time in 2,000 years. But Arabs were appalled at what they saw as the naked theft of half of their country. Arabs responded by attacking Jews in two stages: a guerrilla campaign starting in 1947, followed by invasion by 5 Arab state armies in 1948. The defeat of these attacks, Israel's victory in the so-called War of Independence, had 4 transformative repercussions for the Middle East. First, It confirmed Israel's existence as an independent state in the heart of the Arab world. Israel expanded beyond its UN-allocated borders. Second, during the course of the fighting, 700 to 750,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled their homes and became refugees. This represented some 82% of Arabs within what became Israel. The other 18% remained and became citizens of Israel. Third, the war led to the expulsion or flight of 700,000 Jews from Arab lands, who also became refugees. This represented 95% of Jews living in Arab countries. Most went to Israel. In other words, the war generated two large refugee flows. Fourth, the war of 1947 to 49 utterly shattered Palestinian political leadership. After the catastrophe, al-Nakba, as it became known, direction of the anti-Zionist struggle shifted from Palestinians to the Arab states, chiefly Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. For almost 20 years after the war of 1947 to 49, leadership of the anti-Israel movement remained with the Arab states. Both of the chief antagonists during this period, that is to say Israel and the Arab states, engaged in belligerent, provocative military activity. Israel's strategic goal was to preserve the verdict of 1948. The goal of Arab states was the opposite, to reverse the verdict of 1948. Thus, in 1967, the president of Iraq declared, quote, "We will eliminate the shame that has been with us since 1948. Our goal is clear, to wipe Israel off the map." President Nasser of Egypt repeatedly made similar promises. In 1967, a second major war finally broke out when Nasser, taunted by his Arab rivals for not matching his bold rhetoric with bold action, goaded Israel into attacking Egypt. Once the fighting started, Jordan and Syria opened fire on Israel, even though Israel begged Jordan to stay out of the war on 3 occasions. This conflict, the so-called Six-Day War of 1967, yielded another clear-cut Israeli victory. In the course of the fighting, Israel occupied Sinai, Gaza, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the West Bank of Jordan. This is how Israeli occupation of the West Bank began in 1967. The West Bank and Gaza are now what we call Palestine. Because it remains under Israeli control, the West Bank is also called the occupied territories. Current peace talks are about the future of the West Bank. The Six-Day War discredited the Arab states. Before the war, they had said that they alone could liberate Palestine. Palestinians themselves had to take a back seat. But now, with the defeat of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, Palestinians began to realize that they could rely on no one but themselves. They would have to take their future in their own hands. They therefore formed independent political and military groups that united under the umbrella of the Palestine Liberation Organization, led by the brilliant tactician Yasser Arafat. In 1967 and 68, Israel offered to exchange most of the captured territories in return for peace and recognition. But Arab states and the PLO were staunch rejectionists. Under no circumstances would the PLO recognize the Jewish seizure of historic Palestine. Instead, the PLO's national charter called for the destruction of Israel and the expulsion of all Jews whose families had arrived after 1917. For 25 years, the PLO and Israel engaged in bitter struggle. Of course, this was a wretchedly unequal contest, insofar as Israel was a major military power while the PLO had only paltry guerrilla forces. But the PLO had two major advantages. In the West Bank and Gaza, the PLO retained an unshakable popularity. And secondly, in the wider world, particularly Asia and Africa, people began to identify with the PLO as part of a broader struggle against Western colonialism and domination. To make a long story short, by 1992, both Israel and the PLO were exhausted and ready for some sort of a deal. Israel finally realized it could not destroy the PLO's popularity in the occupied territories. But at the same time, the PLO finally realized it could not destroy Israel. Both sides, therefore, began negotiations to achieve a two-state solution. The idea was that you would have two independent states living peacefully side by side, Israel on the one hand and Palestine, comprising the West Bank and Gaza on the other. Within Israel would reside Israeli Jews and Arab citizens of Israel. In the West Bank and Gaza would reside Palestinian citizens of their own state, Palestine. For 7 years, the two sides talked, known as the Oslo process. This was known as the Oslo process because the negotiations had begun in Oslo, Norway. But by late 2000, they had failed to reach a deal. They couldn't agree on borders, for example. For ideological and strategic reasons, after 1977, Israel had begun planting large-scale settlements in the West Bank. Israel now offered to retain 3 to 5% of the West Bank for the settlements and to evacuate 100% of Gaza. But Palestinians found those proposals unacceptable. The two sides disagreed as well on the future of Jerusalem. Most critically, they disagreed on whether Palestinian refugees from 1948 to 49 should return to their homes in what had become Israel. Palestinians cited United Nations General Assembly Resolution 194, which was passed in 1948, which said that all refugees had a right to return or to compensation. Palestinians claimed that this right extended to the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of the refugees. Israel argued, on the other hand, that Resolution 194 said nothing about an inherited right of return, that GA resolutions are advisory and have no standing in international law, and that to allow 5 million refugees, or any significant fraction thereof, to return would destroy Israel as a Jewish state, and with it would destroy the two-state solution. What finally torpedoed the Oslo process, however, were not these negotiation impasses. Rather, it was the outbreak of violence in late 2000, the Second Intifada. Again, there are two versions as to why the violence broke out. What's clear is that the Second Intifada included a campaign of suicide bombings against Israeli civilians. These bombings completely soured Israelis on the peace process. Palestinians claimed to want a two-state solution, but in practice they still sought Israel's destruction, Israelis concluded. For their part, Palestinians were no less disillusioned. Israel claimed to want a mutual agreement, but throughout the entire Oslo process, Israel had continued to build settlements. In effect, they had sought to impose a solution. After the negotiations collapsed in the midst of the Second Intifada in 2002, both sides, actually, negotiations collapsed in 2000, 2001, but in any case, after this impasse, both sides reverted to unilateral strategies. Israel crushed the Second Intifada. It built a separation barrier to prevent more suicide bombers from entering Israel, and it unilaterally withdrew from Gaza. For their part, anti-Zionists stepped up military activity against Israel. Leadership of the anti-Zionist camp now devolved to two relatively new groups, both Islamist, Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas based in Gaza. Rhetorically, at least, the PLO had moved away from its long-standing refusal to recognize Israel. But both Hamas and Hezbollah revived that position. Both vowed to destroy the Jewish state. Both mounted cross-border attacks, which had the effect and no doubt the intent of stoking tensions. In this climate of bitterness, negotiations had little chance. In 2002, the Arab League offered a generous peace plan. In return for substantial Israeli withdrawal, the League offered to open diplomatic relations with Israel. But Israel effectively killed this offer. In 2008, the Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert improved on Israel's best offer under Oslo. Olmert offered to evacuate land equivalent to virtually 100% of the West Bank, not the 96% that had been offered at Oslo. But Palestinian leaders in the West Bank failed to respond to Olmert's offer. For the past 8 months, talking now in 2014, under intense American pressure, Israel and the Palestinian leaders in the West Bank have resumed discussions to reach a two-state solution. The same issues as bedeviled Oslo seem to be plaguing these current talks: borders, the fate of Jerusalem, the status of refugees. Most observers are pessimistic that the current negotiations will prove any more successful than Oslo. Now, looking back on this sad history, both sides take away entirely different lessons. Each side sees itself as victims with little or no responsibility for tensions, while each portrays its opponents as hopelessly aggressive. This is perfectly natural. Both sides are engaged in political battle. They're engaged in mobilizing their own and world opinion. In battle, you don't seek intellectual detail or nuance. You seek simplistic black-white images in order to rally the troops. But of course, the fact that we're in a university allows us greater distance. Hopefully, we can understand both perspectives without rejecting either. Let's start by considering the Palestinian sense of history. Most Palestinians, I think it's fair to say, see themselves as victims of grave historic injustice. The Arabs of Palestine weren't responsible for the suffering of European Jews, but they had to pay the price because they were forced to give up their land. From 1920 to 1948, Palestinians protested Zionism every way they could, but nothing worked because they lacked the physical power to overthrow the British and to stop Jewish immigration. At bottom, in this view, the period 1920 to 1948 was a story of violent conquest against an inoffensive population. The violence of British rule, the Jews' violent seizure after 1947 of Arab lands, and their violent expulsion of Palestinian refugees. By 1948, the Jews had seized 78% of mandatory Palestine. In 1967, the Israelis took the remaining 22%. Even as we speak, they continue to expand, gobbling up land, seizing water rights, violently repressing Palestinian opposition. In 1930, Jewish lands were small islands in a Palestinian sea. Today, Palestinian lands are islands in an Israeli sea. The IDF confiscates West Bank Arab lands and water through a variety of subterfuges. It impedes Palestinian movement. It responds with disproportionate force against resistance. It demolishes Palestinian homes and resorts to collective punishment in violation of international norms. It often turns a blind eye to vigilante violence by West Bank settlers. The UN Security Council, the International Court of Justice, and virtually every country, including the US, has condemned Israeli settlements. But because the US is unwilling to match its words with practical deeds, Israel has been able to thumb its nose at the world. As Palestinians see it, Israel, with perfect impunity, has thus been able to blockade, isolate, and coerce an entire people. And precisely because the world has sat passively, many Palestinians feel victimized, isolated, and abandoned. The popularity of Hamas and other radical groups derives precisely from their determination not to accept Israeli dictates, but to resist and to uphold Palestinian dignity. This outlook also explains Palestinian commitment to the right of return of refugees. Opinion polls show that 65 years later, a commitment to the right of return remains almost universal among Palestinians. The right of return is unshakable precisely because it's become a defining symbol of identity. If they could go back to their homes, it would mean that Palestinian steadfastness and courage would be rewarded, that their suffering would be redeemed. In practical terms, it would mean also that Israel would change overnight from a Jewish majority to an Arab majority state, and the Jewish state would disappear. Let's turn now to Israeli self-images and Israeli understandings of the past. What scares Israelis is what they see as the irrational demonization to which their country is subjected. And they see this in two spheres. First, Israelis dismiss charges of aggressive expansion. In their view, Israel's only offense has been a refusal. In their view, Israel's only offense has been a refusal to commit suicide. In 1947, Jews were perfectly happy to remain within their UN-allocated boundaries until Arab and Palestinian armies attacked them with the express purpose of strangling the Jewish state. The refugee problem stemmed directly from Israel's effort to defend itself against those attacks. The same was true in 1967, when Arab states, in the Israeli narrative, again forced war on Israel. After the fighting ended, Israel offered to return the territories for peace, but met with flat refusal even to talk. In 2000, Israel offered to return 97% of the territories and was met with a second intifada. In 2008, Olmert offered to return 100% of the territories, only to be met with rockets from Gaza. In short, Israelis say they've tried to end the occupation. On 5 occasions they've tried to end the occupation, but Palestinians simply won't take yes for an answer. In the Israeli view, what Palestinians really want is not an end to occupation in the West Bank, but Israel's ultimate destruction. Hamas says this openly, frequently, and unapologetically. Israelis fear that Mahmoud Abbas says the same thing when he says, as he did recently, that all 5 million Palestinians outside Israel are entitled to Israeli citizenship. Second, Zionists deny that the IDF acts with unusual brutality. If one compares IDF occupation policies, for example, to those of the Indian Army in Kashmir, where it has been involved in the suppression of a separatist movement for 60 years, 65 years, or the operations of the Chinese army in Tibet, or the operation of the Sri Lankan army in the Tamil areas of Sri Lanka, or the operations of the Nigerian army against Boko Haram, or the operations of the Syrian army against the insurgents, or indeed, if one compares Israeli actions to the operations of Palestinian security forces against local opponents, and if one considers such criteria as extrajudicial killings, detention, torture, toleration of dissent, the IDF is unusually restrained. Likewise, Israelis point out, if one compares anti-guerrilla operations, the ratio of civilian to combatant deaths is very low. Israel's 2008 to 2009 retaliatory operation in Gaza, which was the largest of its kind and which received very widespread and generally critical international publicity. In this operation, 750 civilians and 750 combatants died for a ratio of civilians to combatants of 1 to 1. In Chechnya, the Russian army killed 100,000 civilians for a ratio of civilians to combatants of 9 to 1. In Algeria, the army killed 100,000 civilians for a ratio of 4 to 1. Sri Lankan forces killed 12,000 Tamil civilians for a ratio of 6 to 1. In Afghanistan, the NATO ratio is 3 to 1. In campaigns against Kurdish guerrillas, the Turkish army has killed 40,000 civilians. By these measures, each action is considerably more brutal than anything Israel did. But only their country, Israelis complain, only their country faced war crime charges. Moreover, the armies of Algeria, Sri Lanka, Turkey, and other NATO countries all get financial and military help from American taxpayers and American private companies. But none of these countries, Israelis point out, face calls for boycott or divestment. Only Israel faces such charges. Israelis conclude that criticism of the IDF, of the Israeli Defense Force, has little to do with an impartial concern for human rights and everything to do with Israel's enemies finding a stick with which to beat it. So this, it seems to me, is the emotional chasm that divides the two sides. And this is why the prospects of a settlement remain, I'm sorry to say, very poor. Thank you. Do you have any, how much time do I have left?
6 minutes for questions.
Okay, if anybody has any questions.
These are actually going to be from the representatives. So, any assembly members have any questions? Dan Morales, passing the microphone. Yeah, he's on.
So I want to thank you to start for being here and for attempting to give us an impartial overview of the historical context behind the conflict. I do want to, however, point out that the resolution at hand is dealing with the current human rights violations on the ground. And I want to ask you in particular, because you didn't mention international law as much, especially in terms of the 1967 war, how the acquisition of land by force is a violation of the Fourth Geneva Conventions. So I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of the overview of the various human rights violations that have occurred on the occupied territories over time, and what ongoing human rights violations continue there.
Yeah. Well, the acquisition of force in 1967 was in response to declared campaigns whose declared objective was to destroy the state of Israel. There's no question that if those campaigns had succeeded, Israel would have ceased to exist as an independent state.
It doesn't change that it violated international law. That's what I'm...
Well, that would have been a fundamental violation of international law. Israel claims that it is simply defending itself against these essentially unprovoked attacks. After 1967, Israel offered to return the great majority of the territories, with the primary exception of East Jerusalem. But those offers were not only rejected, they were simply ignored. There wasn't any response to those offers. That policy of returning the territories remained in force from 1967 to 1977, whereupon after 10 years with no takers to offers to return the territory, Israel decided to embark under the new Likud government on a program of settlement and acquisition known as the Greater Israel Project. This was in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, everyone accepts, which forbade the settlement of population in conquered territories. Israel had its own take on this because the Fourth Geneva Convention says that only in territories that were subject to a sovereign power before the acquisition was the movement of population forbidden. Israel said that there had been no recognized sovereign power over the West Bank because the Jordanian acquisition had only been recognized by Pakistan, Iraq, and Britain. But that was a kind of nominal point which not many people credited, and almost the entire world, including the International Court of Justice, has said that Israeli actions in the West Bank do violate international law. But as I said, those violations are quite minuscule compared to the violations which no doubt would have occurred had the attack on Israel in 1967 succeeded. The express, oft-repeated purpose of those attacks was to destroy completely the state of Israel, which was a member of the United Nations. These attacks were in complete, flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter.
All right, thank you.
Are there any further